It says it's started now.
You are recording the meeting, right? Good. Welcome to you all. David and Verity have been great. They've given us several hours of their time over the last month, 2 or 3 months, as their name was mentioned as part of some of the work that could be undertaken to support inclusive schools. The local authority, Amelia Walker, knew that Whole Education had been working in several local authorities, supporting schools to help themselves to become good beacons of inclusive practice. And so we've been asked as an association to give you the opportunity to meet with them and to see their offer. And later on next week, we'll be doing a survey to the whole of SAPH membership. And remember, delegates and executive have seen this presentation already. We can also send people to the recording of this meeting. So lots of you will have been able to see what Whole Education's offer is in terms of supporting schools to be inclusive and to improve their inclusive practice, and what the offer is. So I'm going to hand straight over to Verity, who will then hand over to David, and then I believe there'll be some time for some questions. We'll let them leave and I will close the meeting at the end. So over to you, Verity.
Great, thank you, Phil. Are you happy for me to introduce David?
I am indeed. Oh. I am indeed.
Oh, I was actually, I was going to check with David as well, but thanks, Phil. So I'll just start off back with a brief introduction. So my name's Verity Kane. I'm project manager for Whole Education. So I lead on our SEND work, which supports schools and local authorities across different regions to build sustainable communities of learning. So the aim is to improve provision and ultimately outcomes for SEND learners. We're really lucky to have partnered with David Bartram on this work. So for those of you that don't know David was director for SEND at London Leadership Strategy and is also author of the SEND Review Guides and Great Expectations, leading an effective SEND strategy in school. So it's great to have his expertise as part of the work. I am going to now hand over to David, who will introduce kind of the genesis of the work and the context behind it, and I will go through some of the nuts and bolts for you. So over to you, David.
Thank you all, and really, thanks very much for finding time this afternoon. We're not going to keep you too long. Appreciate people have got a lot of priorities on their plate at the moment, so just sort of 20 minutes for us, and then some time for questions at the end. And I just thought I would spend a little bit of time just talking about the sort of rationale for the programme that we've been putting together, and a little bit of the background of the work, sort of where it began, so that people are clear on that. So I'm going to ask, it's going to be a bit like a coronavirus briefing where I ask Verity for the next slide, if that's all right, because we thought rather than various members of us each sharing, it would be simpler if it's just one of us doing that. So just share with you this particularly sensitive advert, I'm sure you'll appreciate, which is actually from the Times Educational Supplement, I think about 1942, so quite extraordinary really, and it talks about the fact that if we give our kids with additional needs Ovaltine for breakfast and for lunch and for dinner, everything will be fine. So there we go, there's our sort of simple SEN development plan for us. And actually what it sort of reflects in some ways is certainly the different perceptions of special educational needs provision, delivery, inclusive education, and how they have changed over the years. And we often make, and I'm going to talk about how we've made the delivery of SEN very complicated over the years, but essentially there's sort of two models, if you like, of approaching things. One is the medical model, which is where the child, if you like, owns the disability. We need to do something to them in order to support them to fit at the system that we've created. And then another is that social model, where actually we consider, the school environment, the curriculum, and so on around the child in order to ensure that they work within our systems more effectively. So what I'm just going to do is just move on to this next slide, which sort of tries to capture the fact that we have made the delivery of SEN incredibly complicated over the years. And Mark Rowland, the sort of pupil premium champion, has just done a really interesting piece of work with a piece of research in Oldham and Derby. And he writes about it in a new book that he's got just out called Addressing Educational Disadvantage. And he found that there wasn't a great deal of difference actually in terms of what schools were doing. What defined the school sometimes that were struggling was often that they were doing too much. And although that was a focused study, particularly on disadvantage, certainly, similarly in terms of some of the work that I've been doing in the area of SEN, there are comparisons, and often we'll see, schools doing an awful lot of stuff, an awful lot of work, but actually not always knowing particularly what difference some of that makes. What are the key things that make the biggest difference to outcomes for learners with SEN? So underpinning the model that we've tried to put together, and I'll speak a little bit about where that's come from in this next slide, is trying to show that we're going to try and keep things as simple as possible. So when it comes to developing leadership of SEN, and this actually is a framework not linked at all to special educational needs, but from the work of Steve Radcliffe, but actually there are some comparisons we can make here around SEN leadership. So the model says, actually, if we're going to be great leaders, we're going to do three things really, really well. The first thing is that we're going to be clear on the vision and where we go. So part of this programme is around really trying to ensure that there's a clear vision and the strategic intent and the direction of the school, and those leaders within that school when it comes to SEN, particularly those SENCOs, are clear on where they want to go. The second strand, or that second focus, is engagement. So that strong leaders, good leaders, build and sustain relationships and create teams as part of that. So considering who their stakeholders are and how they're going to get that collective buy-in. So when it comes to from an SEN perspective, that may be our teachers, our pupils, our parents, our teaching assistants, our external agencies, and they look very, very different in terms of the quality of those relationships across the piece. And then the third strand that we focus on and consider is the delivery part. So it's all very well being sort of charismatic and being able to bring people on board with your vision, but actually, you need some systems and processes in place to enable you to deliver what that vision is. And from an SEN perspective, that may be things like considering our assessment, ensuring that our identification is really strong, provision mapping and understanding the difference that our interventions make and where they're really having impact and so on. Okay, so they're the sort of three strands of that. And where did some of the ideas behind the programme come from? So Verity mentioned I was part of the London Challenge team that led on SEN. I'm not going to go on and on about London Challenge. I think people are sort of in part just fed up of hearing about it. But certainly, back in 2003, it was one of the poorest, or was the lowest performing region in the entire country in London. And then by 2008, actually, it was the highest performing region, and it's continued to do quite well. And how was that achieved? Well, in part, actually, it was nothing complicated, but it was often about matching schools together, and matching leaders together. So head teachers that were inexperienced, matching those alongside experienced heads, schools in particularly difficult circumstances, working alongside schools that were sort of further down that journey in terms of school improvement. And that sort of, I suppose, knowledge mobilisation and recognising that actually there is some excellent practice in Somerset, and that sometimes we can be a little bit better at moving some of that knowledge and practice around the system, is essentially what this programme focuses on. I'm absolutely aware that there are already mechanisms within Somerset in terms of SENCO networks and other things for moving and mobilising some of that knowledge. This is just another way of sort of building on some of that approach, building on some of that work. Next slide, please, Verity, if that's okay. So again, a little bit of background to sort of how it was developed before Verity gets on with the important stuff, and it sort of explains a little bit more on how it works. But been involved in a number of projects leading on sort of, large scale peer review across various different local authorities, from working in Portsmouth, supporting them around a big peer review piece of work across special schools, primaries and secondaries, so very much cross-phase that one. Lincolnshire with the Teaching School Alliance up in Lincolnshire, Kyra, again working across parts of Lincolnshire, and also doing some work in Bournemouth. Those were big SIF projects, but what we wanted to look at was something, again, that didn't require that sort of level of funding, but maintained some of the principles and was accessible for all schools. So this, so in terms of some of the learning from many of those projects, and Also, I guess, many of the reviews that I've done, I mean, I've been in since 2009. I think I've done over 500 SEN reviews of SEN departments over the years. So some of this sort of also, I suppose, tries to capture some of that learning as well. And what certainly we found is that it's really important to have very high quality training at the start of any peer review type piece of work. So that's why when I just talk about a little bit in a moment about who's involved in some of that training, how it works, it's a bit like the sort of aircraft analogy that they use 90% of their energy to get the aircraft up into the air, and then when it's going, hopefully things are more smooth. So certainly when it comes to launching the program, there's a lot of energy and time spent getting that right. The second strand is around drawing on local intelligence. So not interested in doing things to local authorities or to colleagues or schools. Actually, this is about drawing on the knowledge that already exists within the local authority. The idea behind this is that essentially we're not here in 3 years. It's a 3-year program that gradually we sort of step back from over time, and then it becomes Somerset's, and you own that. The third is high quality project management. So sometimes we found that some sort of schools organisations have tried to do some aspects of this themselves, but actually we all know a lot of this takes time, and it needs well qualified, highly motivated project managers to sit behind some of this work if it's going to be a success. Intelligent use of data, we're going to talk about that shortly in terms of how we match schools together. So much of this is around sort of, also relationships and which schools are going to work best alongside each other. QA, so throughout the process, there's a system of quality assurance. So all of the schools involved get, either phone calls or visits or quality assurance of their action plans. And then finally, I think probably the most important thing is that there's head teacher involvement. From that point of view, we ask all of the heads to be there at the launch, for example. When it comes to the self-evaluation of SEND provision in the school, we ask heads, governors to be involved in that process if possible. Next slide, Verity, that's okay. So essentially, what is it? It's about putting schools into triads. There's not a consultant in sight, so this is all led by Somerset schools. And although the training, if you like, will be led by myself and other colleagues, and project management to provide Verity and the whole lead team, at the heart of this is Somerset schools taking the lead. So we've called the head of this triad, if you like, a coach. That's essentially a school that you as colleagues identify could take some sort of a lead in working with and supporting others. So it may be a school that's doing particularly well with children with SEN, for example, and they will work with 2 participant schools. So all of the schools involved in the coaching role, they volunteer for that in conversation with their heads and yourselves. And then those schools wanting to do that participant school, that may be just schools wanting to improve their provision or inexperienced SENCOs or SEN leads, make up that triad. Next slide, Verity, please. That's okay. Really important for us, the reason why we've sort of called them coaches and that coaching model is a lot of people, weren't necessarily aware, but the whole of that London Challenge piece of work actually was underpinned by a coaching model where it was not people coming in and telling others how to do things. It's very much a sort of sustainable model in terms of having those conversations where schools come to the answers themselves very often, with that sort of facilitative coaching type role, rather than identifying experts to come in and tell people what to do. So the idea behind this is that it's going to be long-term and sustainable rather than people coming in, imparting knowledge and leaving. Next slide, please, Verity, if that's okay. So just in terms of some of the nuts and bolts of the programme, what it looks like, and Verity is going to talk in a little bit more depth over the next 10 minutes or so on that. So it's over a year, and ideally, we look to work with schools over a 3-year period, but each cohort of schools runs over a year and split into the 6 half terms. So in half term 1, we have the launch online peer review training. So this is led, that is a half day. We ask head teachers to join just for 25 minutes at the start of the day. And we want to get you at the start because we know what happens if we put it in the middle of the day and people are drawn into things and so on. So nice and early, get things going at the start of the day and ask for your support so you're aware of how things are going. And then for the rest of the morning, real high quality self-evaluation training, looking at data, looking at the national picture, looking at best practice examples and so on as well. And we work across that morning with SENCOs and SEN leaders that join us from the schools. Then all of the schools will do an online self-evaluation, which I'm going to show you shortly. And that's a self-evaluation built on the DFE's sort of best practice guide to SEN, which was the SEND review guide, but also additional information that's got into that. So it reflects the latest Ofsted inspection framework, for example. And schools are then put together in triads. And once they're in their triads, then there's a coaching workshop led by Jackie Smith, who actually trained the National Leaders of Education as part of London Challenge, Levy trained coach, one of the best coaching trainers in the country. And that's a 2.5 hour session for all of the colleagues. So although the participant schools, who may not be coaches necessarily themselves, everyone in the cohort gets access to that real high quality training. And then the rest of the year is essentially what will happen. Then apart of that triad, the coach will then work to put together a very, very simple action plan based around 7 areas: intent, implementation, impact, and then provision mapping, teaching assistants, working with families, identification. And we're just asking schools just to pick one thing from each of those areas, a maximum of 7 things. We're not wanting, action plans of pages and pages long. If your SEN colleagues or SENCOs or assistant head inclusions or whatever it might be, come out of this project feeling like there's more work to do, we have absolutely failed in our aims and objectives. It is about trying to help colleagues, manage the balance sometimes between the operational and the strategic aspects of the role. And we know the degree of paperwork and everything involved in SEN is quite ridiculous anyway, in many respects. And then it's quite light touch. So then there's a couple of progress visits where then the triad comes together and the coach facilitates a discussion and around progress over those half terms. And so action plans come in, they're quality assured in terms of their robustness and their appropriateness, but also linking sort of really helpful pieces of research to particular objectives. And then the triads meet, facilitating discussion around how they're doing. A lot of it, when we've done this with half a dozen local authorities at the moment, actually SENCO's feeling often they're feel quite isolated in the role, and particularly through COVID, actually been quite good just for that reassurance of are we doing the right sort of things here. And then at the end of the process, there is a virtual celebration of learning event where we pull everyone together that's been involved, and actually that's led by Somerset schools, where they actually share the difference that the project has made in terms of the progress that their own schools have made, and we get the triads then to present those together. Throughout that process across the year, there's quality assurance calls, so checking in with the schools in terms of the quality of coaching they've received. Every single action plan is quality assured as well, and all of that information also shared with the head teachers. Okay, so that's a bit of an overview from myself, a bit of a rationale and context, and I think now Verity is going to talk a little bit through some of the sort of nuts and bolts of the processes.
Yes, thank you. I'm just going to break down some of those elements for you. So as David mentioned, the first activity that takes place after that training is the online self-evaluation. So we just use it as a quick and easy way to identify areas of strength that can be shared, but also areas for development. And as David said, there's those 7 key focus areas, and there's about 8 different statements per focus area, and schools evaluate themselves on a scale from 1 to begin 1, which is beginning, to 4, which is excellent. So you can see here that this school, for example, has identified themselves as much more effective in impact, that they're having an identification rather than effective use of teaching assistants and working with learners and families. So they might be the key areas that they decide to focus on moving forward. There is also the option to add comments and evidence, and As a school team, you can have multiple accounts or multiple kind of users per account. So as head teacher, you can log on, you can have a look, you can work with your Senko who also has an account. So it makes it quite easy to work together on that. And it also becomes easy to track your progress over time. So you can track individual focus areas, you can track yourselves as a school, and you can also track groups of schools as well there. Now that data is all taken together. Oh, sorry, this is just some feedback on the self-evaluation from some of our existing participants. That data is then used to form triads of Senkos. As David mentioned, one member of the triad takes on the role of coach, and the coach will then meet with their Senkos. You can see the process coming up on the screen. And the coach works with their Senkos to draft an action plan based on that self-evaluation at an initial visit. And then David Bartram will, or David or kind of a colleague will look at those action plans and provide comments and suggestions. So you can see an example of an action plan here, and you can see that their initial intent was actually more focused around engaging parents and families rather than strategic intent. And so some quality assurance was provided, and then this is the action plan that was submitted afterwards. You can see here, in fact, you might not be able to read, it's probably quite small for you. But the original one was parents and carers are fully involved in developing and reviewing the SEND information report. The report is of high quality. And as I said, that's more about parents. And then finally, their intent came out as the curriculum for learners with SEND is ambitious and designed to give them the knowledge and cultural capital they need to succeed in life, with some really clear actions alongside that as well. And then at least 2 further visits take place. You can see the feedback here from one of those visits, where the action plan is reviewed, coaching conversations using the skills gained in the initial coaching workshop are used, and some mentoring provides support as well. And then this is all underpinned by quality assurance calls, again facilitated by David, to ensure that the process is rigorous and is having the desired impact. And then finally, all schools have access, so not just those involved in the core project, but all schools across Somerset. And I know there's conversations about how this would be funded separately with the local authority, but there is a series of webinars that all schools can access, which provides just some useful strategies, and they're all focused on specific areas of that self-evaluation as well, so tying it all together. And I'll just leave you with that comment from one of our Senkos before I move into the question and answers. Thank you. David, you're muted.
Okay. Hi, Phil. So I hope that was okay, but I'm really happy to answer any questions that colleagues might have this afternoon.
Okay, I'm watching out for hands, David. I'm just seeing if anybody's hand is up. Has anybody got any questions for David or for Verity? There's been quite a lot of conversation within SAPH about the whole education offer, and some people will have heard of it more than others. We've certainly tried to capture the gist of it in some of our comms as well, so it may be that people understand that. Tracy, you've got a question? Tracy Hart?
Hello, yeah, I've probably got a few, to be honest, but my first question is, how long is the programme due to last for? In terms of school, what's the cost implication? Are we expected to set aside some set time for staff to obviously action some of the points? And after doing the initial questionnaire, the initial assessment, what happens in terms of if how do you qualify or check that our level 3 is the same as somebody else's, and then sure. How do you manage them?
Yeah, so great questions. I'll have a go. I'll see what I can do at trying to answer some of those, Tracy, for you. So I mean, in terms of length of the programme, is over 6 terms, so it's a year long, but in terms of the time that schools want to stay within the sort of 3-year framework that we've set aside, the idea, potentially is that those schools that start off as participant schools, if it's something they found valuable and that they grew and had more confidence during that time, then we're seeing in some areas of the country, like in Bedford and others actually, and in Bury, then go on to become coaches themselves. So that sort of can vary in terms of the time that schools are committed to in terms of the length of the programme. In terms of the cost, so we have just some broad costs and the degree with which this is one probably for sort of Phil and the team to decide and discuss, but broadly the cost for 30 schools involved is £30,000. And then for 60 schools, it's 45. So there's a sort of core cost, but the more schools involved, the sort of, more sort of cheaper it becomes, if you like. But there are some discussions, I know, among Somerset colleagues about, primary schools, a sliding scale around that really for primaries and secondary.
David, if I could just interject there a little bit, it's a little bit, one of the difficulties we've got in presenting this project to people is we don't know the cost of it until we know how many people are interested. And one of the things we wanted to do was, and I know the secondary school colleagues are more prepared to take on a greater share of the cost than any primary participants would be, because of course their budgets are significantly more. But in the first instance, we need to find out how many primary schools want to take part, how many secondary schools want to take part. We also want to try and squeeze some money out of the local authority, because there is an offer of all of the webinars for all of Somerset schools, even if they don't take part. So we felt that it might be appropriate. And also SAPH has some small reserves that it might use to support some of its colleagues from its SAPH membership to take part in it as well. So it won't be £1,000 each if it was 30 schools, and it won't be 45 divided by 60 either. It will be the secondary schools taking on more of a share of the costs, but we aren't quite sure. It would be in hundreds, I think, to primary schools who took part. And then we might be in a position as an association to support primary schools who are faced with a bill they couldn't afford, because we would like anybody who wants to do it to be able to do it. Does that help, Tracy?
That's great. Thanks, Phil.
Couple on. So in terms of, it was a great question actually around the sort of, I suppose, quality assurance of, well, how do we know if one school has puts it a 3 and that's, and another school is a 2, and what that really looks like in practice and so on. That's always a challenge, isn't it, in education? I mean, the project that I ran in Birmingham, actually, we had the schools that were most positive about their self-evaluation probably had the weakest provision. And the schools that were most sort of toughest on themselves on the self-evaluation probably had the strongest provision. And even within perspectives within your own school, if you're doing a self-evaluation, whether it's leadership teams, or class teachers or whatever, actually everyone has that slightly different perspective. First of all, I'd say the most important thing is not necessarily the number here, but the quality of the conversation that's taken place in leadership teams, and that, it's not a Senko completing this on their own in a converted toilet like I was for about 10 years as a Senko. Actually this is a sort of collective discussion, and that is the most important sort of aspect of that, whatever the number is. That's why this is not Ofsted. There's no terminology around good, outstanding, requires to improve in any single piece of paperwork that we've put together. But the second part around, at least trying to address that, is there's the importance of the self-evaluation training, because that training at the start focuses on actually, offering examples of what does, a high quality piece of work in this area look like, and getting colleagues to discuss that and share together. But also then the role of the coach who's leading there, part of that initial putting the action plan together is a bit of a sort of like moderation of that self-evaluation to say, well, look, you've put down that you feel you're excellent here. What does that look like in practice and so on? So yeah, you're right. There's no perfect solution to that, but we've tried to at least sort of address that within some of those areas. And then I think the final question was linked to sort of time commitments for staff. And we've tried to keep this reasonably light touch, as I said. So actually, if you think about the training aspect of it, it's round about a day, and there's approximately sort of 3 days of commitment of time. across the sort of meeting up together. So those triad meetings, they're just a couple of hours and they take place 3 times. And then there's obviously some of the time taken to put the action plan together and so on. So it's sort of reasonably light touch from that point of view. And that's a commitment that we're asking schools to make. We think that the very best, CPD that you can get does not involve taking a day out necessarily to spend a few £100 to go to some conference where you get 20 minutes of so-called best practice, and often the most useful parts of any sort of education conference are those times over lunch when you're actually discussing with colleagues what they do in their own school. Immersing yourself in other people's practice, we feel is some of the best training that you can get. So from that point of view, it's not necessarily sort of, it's a good CPD experience and not hugely expensive. So that's a bit of an overview. Is there anything else there that I've sort of not picked up that you wanted me to address, Tracy, in those questions?
No, thanks. You were very thorough. I missed the slide. I don't know if it's at all possible where you put on the different titles for when you were doing the evaluation. I got down intent, implementation, impact, working with learners and families, and effective use of TAs, but I didn't get the last few. I just wondered if you could just throw that.
So it's provision, mapping and identification.
And Tracy, we are recording the meeting, so you would have an opportunity to revisit this and just find your way through the recording to the slide you wanted.
Sorry, I won't monopolise you anymore. Thanks.
Not at all. Not at all. I don't feel you were monopolising us at all.
There's flexibility around that, so absolutely not precious about these. I mean, if for example, primary colleagues felt like there was a particular thing that you wanted, colleagues to focus on, it may be the transition from primary to secondary, really trying to get that right. We can add all of this stuff, pull, strip stuff out, not precious about it at all. Part of this is to sort of save time, put something together in terms of the content. But if the things people wanted to change, of course, very happy, open to that.
Okay, colleagues, are there any other questions for David or Verity whilst they're here? What we'll do is we'll give you the link to the recording. You may well take some time to sit down with maybe your Senko, or if you are the Senko, with your head teacher. But it's been really useful having you here. I'd like to thank David and Verity for being here with us. Pleasure. And I'll let those two leave now because they've done more than their bit for Somerset and said we still haven't said yes to them yet. I'll let those two go and I'll just give you a little bit of information where we're going to go next with this. So thanks, David. Thanks, Verity.
Thanks.
Take care.
Nice to meet you all.
Thanks very much. I've put my email address in the chat in case anyone does have any questions.
Fantastic. Thank you for that, Verity.
Lovely.
Cheers.
Thanks so much.
Bye.
Bye. So, colleagues, we're just going to give you the opportunity. We will send out the recording link to all head teachers again. It's not always easy to find a time when people can get to a meeting. I don't know if there's anybody here in the meeting who already feels it's something they would be interested in joining in with. If you'd like to indicate by putting your hand up now, that would be interesting if it's something you think you might be interested in.
You're still recording, Phil. Are you meaning to?
I am meaning to, because I think it would be useful for people to see that as well, actually, just to hear our things. But you're quite right. I think I'll stop recording now. But it's quite useful to see the hands up. Nobody is going to be